responsibilities of children and women varied widely among ethnic and social groups from colony to colony. In the early southern colonies, families couldn't afford their wives not working with them. Families needed the extra hands to survive. As a result, the ideal role of wives and mothers shifted a bit, with women doing the same jobs as their husbands. But as colonies became more established and prospered, society once again began praising the European model of a woman. White wives began taking order of the household, managing servants and slaves. This was not the same in every colony, though. The people who founded the northern colonies stuck to their religions and had women play head of the household from the very start of the New World. The battle for women's suffrage in the US began with the women's rights movement in the mid-19th century. The first attempt to organize a national movement for women's rights occurred in Seneca Falls, New York in July 1848. The movement was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a young mother from New York, and Lucretia Mott, a Quaker abolitionist, along with about 300 people, mostly women. They attended the Seneca Falls Convention to make their future plans and schemes clear. Stanton gave a speech listing the inequalities, unfair laws, and social and cultural norms that prevented women from their privileges as people of the United States. The convention eventually ended with a new voting rights goal. Like most women of the era, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were strong abolitionists and wanted to put an end to slavery. After first meeting in 1850, Stanton and Anthony made a lifetime alliance as women's rights activists. After the Civil War, the two of them helped create a movement dedicated to women's suffrage and pressured lawmakers to guarantee their rights during Reconstruction. So for my technological component, I have made a mind map that talks about the things that happened during the women's movement. Here is a little snippet of it that talks about the different associations and movements that are made. After the emancipation of African American slaves, radical Republicans in Congress proposed an amendment extending citizenship rights and equal protection under the law to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. This new law only covered male citizens. On July 23, 1866, Representative James Brooke of New York found Stanton's petitions as well as a letter by Anthony and decided to support their women's suffrage movement. In 1868, Brooke proposed a constitutional amendment to guarantee everyone's right to vote without any distinction or discrimination whatsoever founded on race, color, or sex. Even though other representatives also supported the movement, the resolution never came to a vote. There are actually many times in history where women almost won the right to vote, but in the end it wasn't achieved. Here are some examples of that. In response to the setbacks in Congress, women's rights activists focused completely on women's right to vote. But the women's movement struggled to agree on the tactics to achieve their goals and split into two organizations in 1869, the National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, AWSA. When neither group got much support, they realized that splitting into two had hindered rather than helped their movement. However, a turning point occurred in the late 1880s and 90s, when America experienced a surge of volunteerism among middle-class women. Women suddenly became involved in clubs, societies, and became advocates for women's suffrage. Here is another part of my mind map that briefly talks about the progressive era, what it means, and what happens during it. By 1890, the two groups converged again to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. For the next 20 years, the NWSA worked as an organization that was unbiased to any particular political group. They focused on gaining the vote in the states as a precursor to a federal suffrage amendment. However, the suffrage movement was only so welcoming. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, civil rights and voting rights were criticized and fought about greatly in large sections of the US, as state policies and court decisions essentially made the 14th and 15th Amendment void. As segregation became law in the South, few suffrage advocates did or said anything to help African American people. African American activist Mary Church Terrell spoke about these injustices while still remaining hopeful that they could change. Many African American suffragists like Terrell fought for the right to vote. However, Congress didn't listen, and from 1901 to 1929, no African American legislature served in Congress. Where west of the Mississippi River, women won complete voting rights in Wyoming in 1869, but went almost another 25 years without another accomplishment. But after launching the NWSA in 1890, women won the right to vote in 3 western states, and between 1910 and 1914, the NWSA achieved victories in 5 states as well. This is another part of my mind map that talks about the things that women achieve over time. The 1916 election of Jeannette Rankin of Montana to serve in the 65th Congress created the Winning Plan campaign. The NWSA embraced the war, believing that women would prove themselves in their support overseas, and that extending the franchise at home would be a crucial step to the movement. They argued that failure to extend the vote to women would hurt their war participation as workers and volunteers outside of the home. New Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin used every bit of publicity that she could to advocate for women's rights, and after her election, Congress changed the way that they handled women's suffrage. She was the sole reason that women's rights to vote was almost achieved on January 10, 1918. But it wasn't, and Rankin was defeated in her Senate seat and did not return for the 66th Congress. By 1919, women had won the right to vote in 15 of the 48 states. The House voted on May 21, 1919, in favor of women's suffrage. It took nearly 15 months for the required number of states to ratify the amendment. But on August 1920, the amendment was officially added to the Constitution. Only 2.5 months later, in November 1920, millions of women voted for the first time in the congressional and presidential elections. The success of the Women's Campaign and their political leaders demonstrated that women could and would vote and serve on their own terms, that women had long been active in politics, and that regardless of their differences, women were going to continue to redefine what was possible in America, but this time, finally, with a ballot in hand. So for my artifact, I chose to make a pottery version of a women's rights sunflower pin. So I did this because in 1876, Kansas suffragettes used the yellow sunflower, the state flower, as a symbol for their campaign. And before this, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had written for The Lily, a largely self-control focused newspaper, under the pen name Sunflower. Advocates for temperance saw a direct connection between women's right to vote and the support/molding of temperance laws. From there, the sunflower and the color yellow and gold are often used on posters, signs, pins, newspapers, photos, and more as a symbol of supporting women's rights. So there you go. Thank you.